My name is Evan Mercer. I was 24 in December of 1999, and my father lived alone about 3 hours north of me in rural Ohio. He had gone through a difficult year financially after the plant where he worked reduced everyone's hours, and his house needed several expensive repairs. My father would quietly work around a problem before asking either of his children for help, so without telling him, I spent most of that year saving what I could. By the end of December, I had $1,100. I put the money in an envelope, folded the envelope inside a brown paper grocery bag, and placed it on the passenger seat of my tan 1991 Buick. My plan was to surprise him before New Year's Eve and spend the millennium with him. I did not have a cell phone back then. I had a paper map, several cassette tapes, and a strip of yellow legal paper on which I had written the directions my father gave me over the phone. I was supposed to follow Route 9 north for a long stretch, turn at County Road 6, pass an old grain elevator, and then make 2 more turns toward his house. My father said that route would save almost 40 minutes compared with the highway. I left a little after 3 that afternoon. By 5:30, the countryside was getting dark and the radio was fading between towns. Almost every station was talking about the millennium. Computer systems, New Year's parties, countdown clocks. The whole country seemed to be waiting for something, and at the time I was mostly thinking about getting to my father's house before he went to bed. A little before 6, I stopped at a small roadside store near Route 9 because I wanted to use the payphone. The place had weathered wooden siding, a gravel parking lot, 2 old gas pumps, and an ice cooler beside the entrance. I picked up the payphone receiver and realized I needed coins. I checked my pockets, but only had bills. Calvin said, "Need some change?" I turned and saw a man standing near the ice cooler. He looked to be in his early 50s and wore a heavy canvas jacket, work boots, and a dark cap. There was nothing unusual about him. He looked like someone you might pass in a hardware store and forget a minute later. I said, "I need a couple quarters." The man handed me 3. I tried giving him $1, but he shook his head. Calvin said, "Keep it. You might need another phone before the night is over." I said, "Hopefully not." He smiled and introduced himself as Calvin Rusk. I called my father and told him approximately where I was. While we talked, I checked the yellow directions and then reached through the open passenger window of the Buick to put them back on the seat. My father reminded me to watch for frost on the smaller roads, and I told him I should arrive later that evening. When the call ended, Calvin was still outside. He asked about the Buick and whether I had much farther to go. I told him I was heading north to see my father for New Year's. We talked about old cars for a few minutes. Calvin knew much more about them than I did and was friendly without seeming overly interested in me. That detail matters because if Calvin had made me uncomfortable at the store, I would never have trusted him later. Before leaving, I went inside for an orange soda and a candy bar. The clerk was helping someone else, so I was inside for several minutes. When I came back out, Calvin was gone. I did not see what he was driving, and I did not look for him. I got into the Buick and continued north. For about half an hour, everything was normal. Then the Buick hesitated. It was only a small drop in power, and the engine recovered almost immediately. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time the car felt uneven for several seconds. I turned the music off. The engine settled again, but another few miles later, it began losing power in longer waves. There were no houses nearby and no businesses, only Route 9 cutting through dark woods. Then the engine stopped. I coasted onto the shoulder and tried starting it several times, but it would not catch. I got out with my flashlight and opened the hood. I knew almost nothing about engines, so after checking for anything obviously loose, I gave up. There was a faint gasoline smell that seemed stronger than normal, but I had no idea what that meant. I got back inside and waited. Without the engine running, the woods seemed much louder. I heard an owl somewhere far away, smaller animals moving through dry leaves, and later coyotes in the distance. None of those sounds were unusual, but sitting alone in a dark car made every noise seem closer. About 25 minutes later, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. A pickup slowed and stopped behind me. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out carrying a flashlight. When the light crossed his face, I felt an immediate wave of relief. It was Calvin. Calvin said, "Well, this is unexpected. You are the guy from the store." I said, "You have no idea how glad I am to see somebody." Calvin asked, "Car acting up?" I explained what happened, and Calvin asked me to open the hood. He spent several minutes looking around the engine and seemed to know what he was doing. Calvin said, "Could be something in the fuel system. I do not think you are getting this started out here tonight." I asked, "Do you know where the nearest phone is?" Calvin said, "My house is not far. You can use mine and call your father." I asked, "How far?" Calvin said, "Right up the road." I hesitated, but only briefly. Calvin no longer felt like a complete stranger. We had talked earlier. He had helped me with the payphone, and now he had appeared when I needed help most. I took the grocery bag from the Buick, folded it beneath my coat, and locked the car before getting into Calvin's pickup. Calvin pulled onto Route 9 and almost immediately turned around. I said, "My father is north." Calvin said, "I know." I said, "I thought you said your house was up the road." Calvin said, "It is nearby. This way is easier." He drove south for several minutes before turning onto a narrow county road. I asked, "If you live back this way, then what were you doing that far north?" Calvin said, "I was checking on some property for a friend." I asked, "Out there?" Calvin said, "He is away for the holidays and asked me to drive past it." The answer was possible, but something about how quickly Calvin moved away from the subject bothered me. He started talking about New Year's and asked whether my father planned to watch the countdown. Then he asked about my job, whether my father lived alone, and whether anyone else was expecting me that night. None of the questions sounded especially strange by themselves. Then I noticed how long we had been driving. I asked, "How much farther?" Calvin said, "Almost there." I said, "You said you lived close." Calvin smiled and said, "Everything feels farther out here after dark." We turned onto another road, then another. The pavement became gravel and the trees closed in on both sides. I tried remembering the turns. Right, left, a long straight stretch, another right. After more than 35 minutes, I asked again. I asked, "Calvin, how much longer?" Calvin said, "Just a few minutes." It was nearly 45 minutes after leaving my Buick when he finally turned between two old fence posts onto a dirt driveway. There was no sign, and I could not see a mailbox. The driveway curved so far into the trees that the road disappeared behind us. At the end stood a farmhouse. It was not abandoned or falling apart. It was simply isolated. Dark siding, a low porch, and one yellow light above the front door. Every curtain was closed, and there were no other lights anywhere around us. Calvin said, "Here we are." I said, "You really are out here by yourself." Calvin said, "I like the quiet." Calvin got out of the truck, and before heading toward the house, he reached behind the driver's seat and pulled out a folded newspaper. I barely noticed it at the time. He tucked it under one arm and walked toward the porch. I followed him inside. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. A living room opened on the left, and a narrow hallway ran toward the back. Everything was clean and still. A beige telephone sat on a small wooden table halfway down the hallway. Calvin walked to the telephone table and set the folded newspaper beside the phone. Calvin said, "The phone is right there. I will make some coffee while you call your father." I said, "Thanks." Calvin disappeared into the kitchen, and I walked toward the telephone. I picked up the receiver. Nothing. I pressed the switch once and listened again. Still nothing. I was about to call out to Calvin when I noticed something sticking out from between the folded pages of the newspaper he had just put down. A thin edge of yellow paper. At first I only stared at it. Then I pulled it out slightly. I saw my handwriting. Route 9 North, County Road 6, grain elevator, my father's road. For several seconds, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. I carefully slid the paper farther out and unfolded it. There was a faded coffee mark near the bottom where my thermos had leaked earlier that afternoon, and a small, uneven tear where I had pulled the page from the legal pad. It was mine. Those were the directions I had left on the passenger seat of my Buick, and Calvin had just carried them into the house inside his newspaper. My hand started shaking. That was when it hit me. Calvin had not found me stranded on Route 9. He had known exactly where I would be. From the kitchen, Calvin called, "You take sugar?" I nearly dropped the paper. "No sugar." I slid the directions back into the newspaper and left the same thin yellow edge showing. Footsteps came down the hallway. Calvin appeared in the doorway holding a spoon. For a moment, he just looked at me. Then his eyes moved to the telephone and finally to the newspaper. "Phone working?" I shook my head. "Nothing, no dial tone." Calvin walked over and lifted the receiver himself. He listened for a few seconds before putting it back. "Old line. It does this sometimes." My eyes moved toward the front door. Calvin noticed. "My father is expecting me," I said. "My cousin is driving this way tonight too. If he sees the Buick, he will stop." That was a lie. Calvin looked at me for a little too long. Then his eyes dropped to the newspaper, only for a second. "Then you have nothing to worry about." Neither of us spoke. Calvin gave me a small smile and started back toward the kitchen. "Coffee is almost ready. Sit down and warm up." He disappeared through the doorway. The frightening part was that his voice had never changed. He still sounded exactly like the man I had been relieved to see on Route 9. I walked into the living room and sat near the edge of an armchair. I heard a cabinet open and then the quiet sound of a spoon against a mug. The front door was maybe 15 feet away. I remembered one of the floorboards had creaked when we came in, but I could not remember which one. I stood slowly. My coat brushed the chair. I stopped. The spoon moved again in the kitchen. I took 2 careful steps along the wall. Then the kitchen went silent. I froze. A few seconds later, water started running. I moved again. Halfway to the door, a floorboard clicked beneath my shoe. The water stopped. I did not move. Nothing. Then I heard a cup touch the counter. I reached the door and slowly turned the lock. From the kitchen, Calvin said, "Evan?" Every muscle in my body tightened. I said, "Yeah?" Calvin asked, "You still good without sugar?" I said, "Yeah, I am good." Calvin said, "All right." The spoon moved again. I opened the door just enough to slip through and stepped onto the porch. I did not close it completely because I did not want the latch to make noise. The driveway was gravel, so I stayed on the frozen grass instead. Calvin's pickup blocked part of the house from view, and I moved quietly beside it. The trees were about 20 yards away. I reached the rear of the truck. Dry leaves shifted beneath my shoe. The front door opened. I lowered myself beside the pickup and stayed still. Calvin stepped onto the porch. Calvin called, "Evan?" I did not answer. Calvin asked, "You outside?" His voice still sounded normal. Calvin walked toward the pickup. I moved slowly around the opposite side so the truck remained between us. His boots stopped. I stopped too. There could not have been more than 10 feet between us. Calvin said, "Coffee is ready." I moved toward the back of the pickup while Calvin moved toward the front. Then I heard him touch the driver's door. I went straight for the trees. Calvin called, "Evan?" I kept moving until the farmhouse disappeared through the woods. Only then did I stop. A short time later, Calvin's truck started. Headlights moved between the trees near the driveway. I stayed hidden until the truck reached the road and the engine faded into the distance. Then I moved in the opposite direction. I had no idea where I was going, and I did not want to use any road Calvin expected me to take, so I kept moving downhill through the trees until I found a shallow drainage ditch running away from the property. There was almost no water in it, just cold mud, stones, and dead leaves. I climbed down and followed it. The ditch kept me lower than the surrounding ground, and for the first time I felt slightly less exposed. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard Calvin's pickup again. I lowered myself beside the bank and stayed still. Headlights appeared through the trees on another narrow road above me. The truck slowed, then it stopped. The engine remained running. For what felt like a very long time, the headlights did not move. I could hear nothing except the engine and water moving faintly somewhere farther down the ditch. Then the truck continued. The headlights disappeared. I waited until I could no longer hear it before moving again. I stayed with the drainage ditch for another stretch until it widened and passed beneath an old wooden crossing. Beyond that, the trees began thinning. A few minutes later, I saw lights. At first, I worried I had somehow circled back toward Calvin's farmhouse, but then I saw 2 vehicles parked beside another house and several rooms lit inside. I crossed the yard and knocked. A middle-aged couple answered, and after I explained that my car had stopped and I had become uncomfortable at another house nearby, they brought me inside. The husband contacted the county office, and I gave them my father's number. Hearing my father's voice again was one of the greatest feelings of relief I can remember. People checked Calvin's farmhouse later that night, but his truck was gone and nobody answered. They returned again the following day with the property owner. Calvin was still gone. The house had been rented several months earlier under the name Calvin Rusk. The owner knew little about him because Calvin paid on time and mostly kept to himself. My Buick was collected the next morning. The mechanic found a fresh, clean cut in one of the fuel lines. He told me it was not the kind of damage that came from age or normal wear. Someone had done it deliberately. Calvin had been close enough to my Buick at the roadside store to take the yellow directions from the passenger seat. The envelope with $1,100 had been sitting right beside them. He took the directions. He left the money. That was the part I could never explain. Whatever Calvin wanted that night, it was never the $1,100. It was me.